This is class 114 on the Golden Doves. We're on page 64. Another beautiful morning, a little cool. So we're on the bottom of page 64, and just to tell you what we're up to, we are studying the idea of negation. We studied the idea of negation in Hegel, negativity in Hegel. We're now going to study the idea of negation in Sigmund Freud, and this would form the foundation for a deep and profound understanding of Harambam, because Harambam speaks about negation, and that's one of the principal ideas of Harambam in the Moreh Nebuchim. By the way, obviously Harambam was before Hegel, and Harambam was before Sigmund Freud, right? So these are deep ideas that these thinkers thought about. Did they read Harambam? Didn't they read Harambam? I don't know, right? But I do know that what they say is pertinent to understanding Harambam. It helps us understand Harambam. So let's do now. Let's read the passage from Sigmund Freud. In a different context, Freud also relates negation to freedom, right? So we showed how in Hegelian thinking there's a relationship between negation and freedom. Sigmund Freud as well, at the psychological level. Okay, this is a really tough passage in Sigmund Freud, as many of his passages are really difficult, but we will try to read it slowly and parse it carefully. So, here goes. The study of judgment affords us, perhaps for the first time, an interplay, an insight into the origin of an intellectual function. Okay, let's the study of judgment. How does the human mind judge things? Okay, so for example, they have so many things that we're bombarded with on TV in the realm of society, in the realm of culture, in the realm of values, in the realm of the political. So many different values. Right. So for example, there was a time not too long ago in America where same-sex marriage was considered forbidden, right? It was considered looked down upon. We're not going to tell them what to do, but to get married, that's already a violation of a family institution, so we would certainly not allow that. So Obama famously opposed same-sex marriage, as did Clinton and many, of course, everybody else. I mean, I'm bringing examples of right-wing people to show that it was universally acknowledged that this is no good. Then, in a very short amount of time, suddenly same-sex marriage became legal, I believe, in many, many states in the USA. Okay, so there's a judgment. The judgment is it good or is it bad? Do we support it? Do we oppose it? So you see, the mind is making a judgment now. At a certain time, again, not too long ago, the judgment was no, it's bad. Right? Then suddenly the judgment changed. Right? So we're studying about judgment. And by studying about judgment, we get an insight into the origin of an intellectual function, right? So obviously judgment has to do with the intellect, right? Not every intellectual function is rational, but there's an intellectual function going on here, correct? From the interplay of the primary instinctual impulses. And the bedrock of the foundation of these intellectual functions is the interplay of different instinctual impulses, meaning at the very core, at the root of thinking are different impulses. There's a Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara itself has different branches. There's a Yetzer HaTov, right? And there's an interplay between the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer HaTov, right? And that impels intellectual functioning, which itself basically results in the judgment, right? So the judgment comes from the intellectual functioning, which comes from the interplay between the different instinctual impulses. That's really deep, by the way. What he's actually saying is that we think that we're free. And we think, oh yeah, people now support same-sex marriage. That's a good example. Oh, well, of course, I reached a judgment that same-sex marriage, of course, it should be allowed, right? Or today, they mutilate children in public school. I think that it's a big, and I think probably just 2 years ago, mutilation or gender affirming care, whatever. I don't want to use the word mutilation because that prejudges. I don't want to prejudge things. I want to deal with the function of judgment, right? So gender affirming care, which is essentially, genital mutilation. So a very, very short time ago, the judgment would have said, no, this is wrong. And now the judgment says, no, or many people, not everybody, says, no, it's fine. In fact, you must perform gender affirming surgery on children, otherwise you're bad for not doing it. So what is underlying the judgment? What is underlying the judgment is a certain intellectual apparatus, and what impels an intellectual apparatus is various instincts, right? Judging is a continuation along lines of expediency of the original process by which the ego took things into itself or expelled them from itself according to the pleasure principle. So the ego is what mediates the conscious from the unconscious mind. So there's this ego, right? And it's the shaliach between the conscious and unconscious, right? And there was an original process, an intellectual process, where the ego, it integrates certain things into itself. The ego is the self, is the person, right? But other things it expels. So again, a few years ago, they used to complain about Muslims that they would do female genital mutilation, and people were repelled by that, right? So there are certain things that now perhaps not so much, right? But so what we're seeing here is how it works. There are certain things that the ego repels. There are certain things that the ego integrates. Why would it repel that? For example, based on the pleasure principle. So people think about that, and they think about how that would feel or what that would do to them, right? So it's horrible thought. It's just disgusting. So the ego repels it. Not because it's intellectual. No, there is an intellectual. That is intellectual. The word is rational. Not because there is a rational process, but rather this goes against the pleasure principle. So I automatically repel something because it feels very unpleasurable, the idea, right? And hence I reach the intellectual judgment that, I'm against it, right? But things change. So why today is it okay to perform gender-affirming care, right, on children, which is essentially, a type of mutilation, right? Why is that okay? What's the difference? What changed? Okay. The polarity of judgment. So there's a certain polarity within the process of judgment. Every judgment, you have the two scales. There's always going to be a polarity in any judgment by its nature. And here we're talking about the ego judging things, integrating certain things, repelling certain things. The polarity of judgment appears to correspond to the opposition of the two groups of instincts. Okay, so in Freudian psychology, there are two primary groups of instinct. There's the eros, which represents life. I believe it's the death or destructive principle, which represents, I think it's called Thanatos, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, whatever it's called. Yeser HaTov and Yeser Hara. Again, Hachamim discussed this before Freud, and I'm not saying that Freud got this from the Hachamim, but we can quote Freud in this because it's similar to the Divrei Chazal, right? So the polarity of judgment, so there's Yeser HaTov and Yeser Hara, there's this debate going on, appears to correspond to the opposition of the two groups of instincts which we have supposed to exist. He says, I believe there's two primary groups of instincts within the ego. Affirmation, that's one of them. To affirm things as a substitute for uniting. So affirmation allows us to unite with certain ideas, to incorporate certain ideas into our thinking. Belongs to Eros. Eros is the life principle. And again, there's not a complete, it's parallel to Yeser Hara and Yeser HaTov, but it's not equal to Yeser Hara and Yeser HaTov, meaning what Freud calls Eros is not the equivalent of the Yeser HaTov, right? But there's a certain parallelism in that type of thinking, right? So the eros incorporates things into itself. That's the uniting principle, the life principle. But then there's the negation. So there's certain things that we negate. So for example, now we incorporated, or Western society, or some people in Western society in America, have incorporated the idea of gender affirming care as something positive, right? So that's the eros, which is to say we want now to create this uniting principle, and in this way we also unite. I don't know if this is what Sigmund Freud meant, but by accepting these ideas, we unite with others in society, and we feel like we're part of a larger group or a larger construct. And in so doing, we give certain meaning to ourselves because we're not alone. Again, I don't know if that's what Freud meant when he says as a substitute for uniting, but I see that very clearly. So that when we accept the ideas that society imposes upon us, in this case it's the world elite, that are intentionally injecting these ideas by force, and they're doing it successfully. So when we accept those ideas, we become united and we feel good. We're becoming like other people, and other people around us, we can feel part of that, right? But then there's negation, and again, I think that was thanatos, the successor to expulsion. There's part of the ego that says, no, I find this repulsive. Belongs to the instinct of destruction. But for Freud, that has to do with, we want to destroy. We want to be destructive, the Yetzer Hara, right? Again, analogous but not equal to the Yetzer Hara, right? So there's part of me that says, I don't want the world around me. I want to destroy the world. I want to, in Freudian thinking, right? I want to destroy the world. I want to cut myself off. I want to be, a loner, right? So those two instincts within the person are competing. Now here you have negation in Freudian thinking. All right. But the performance of the function of judgment is not made possible until the creation of the symbol of negation has endowed thinking with a just measure of freedom from the consequences of repression. Right now. So therefore, in order to have a judgment, you have to have two scales. So one scale is eros, incorporate things, unite things, accept things, be accepting, accept society. We're now more modern, right? We're more, we have to give up the ideas of the past and to move forward. Wow, what a beautiful idea. So I'm going to unite with these ideas and incorporate these ideas into my thinking, right? But then, that's only a judgment if I have the possibility of saying no. The great chidush of Sigmund Freud is, if you can't say no, then you're not really making a judgment, right? So the performance of the function of a judgment is not made possible until the creation of the symbol of negation. You can have an intellectual apparatus, and the intellectual apparatus is based on the different conflicting, notions within the pleasure principle, or forces within the pleasure principle, but you can't have a judgment. To have a judgment, you have to have developed the idea of negation within your psyche, within your ego. So, the creation of the symbol of negation has endowed thinking with a just measure of freedom. If you can't negate, if you can't say no, you're not free, right? A just measure of freedom from the consequences of repression, and with it, from the compulsion of the pleasure principle. So that's important, because there's a certain repression. I'm not sure what Sigmund Freud was referring to when he says the consequences of repression, right? But I think what Sigmund Freud meant is that there are certain unconscious processes that keep unwanted thoughts or unwanted memories, unwanted impulses deep within the subconscious of the individual, right? So, to negate, you have to repress certain Yetzer Hara. This is what Sigmund Freud is saying. You have to, for example, let's say hedonism, Sedom v'Amora. So you're going to be a person who says no to Sedom v'Amora. I reject Sedom v'Amora. So I'm making a judgment now, right? In order to be able to say no to Sedom v'Amora, in order to be able to say no to, whatever ideology you're saying no to. So now we have in America people gender affirming care, trans rights, everything should be allowed. Not only everything should be allowed, we must have this in public. Okay, that's the judgment. But then people say, no, I reject this. Okay, in order to say no, I reject this, in order to negate, you have to be free from the consequences of repression, which is to say that when you repress the Yetzer Hara, there's certain consequences to that, right? You have to be willing to deal with those consequences. And if you can't deal with those consequences, you're not going to be able to negate, because what's going to happen is it'll explode outwardly in other forms, right? So, right? And with it, from the compulsion of the pleasure principle. Meaning the pleasure principle is saying, no, hedonism is good. Sedom v'amonah is wonderful. All these things are great. To be able to negate those things, you need to be free from the compulsion of the pleasure principle, which when you repress it, it can erupt the other ways. So you need to know how to manage those different instincts intelligently in a way where it doesn't become repressed. That's Sigmund Freud. Amazing stuff, by the way, I have to tell you. There's a lot of analogies. First of all, he's a very deep thinker. I want you to realize he's a very deep thinker, all right? He thought about these things deeply, and he makes us think about this deeply. And now we can go into the Torah perspective and understand the Torah perspective more profoundly, precisely because Sigmund Freud really took us down the rabbit hole here. So we studied Hegel, we studied Sigmund Freud, but neither tomorrow or whenever I do the next recording, we will study Rambam's approach to negativity.